Good evening and welcome to the Democracy Series hosted by the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government, the University of Chicago Center on Democracy, and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. My name is Sadia Singhu and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Effective Government housed here at the Harris School of Public Policy. At the Center for Effective Government, we bring together scholars and practitioners to host robust discussion and generate ideas about how we can strengthen democratic institutions in service of a more effective government. In this third installment of this book series, we're speaking with authors Alex Bolton and Sharece Thrower for the launch of their book, Checks and the Balance, Legislative Capacity and the Dynamics of Executive Power, which launched today. Congratulations. You'll have the opportunity today to hear them speak about various aspects of their book, and we'll save about 15 minutes for audience questions. Please feel free to use our Zoom Q&A function if you have any questions for them. Tonight's conversation will be recorded and will be shared on Twitter at UChicagoCEG. If you enjoyed the conversation today, I encourage you to attend our next Democracy Series event on January 20th, where we will continue to explore the state of democracy. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's authors. Alex Bolton is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Emory University. He studies American political institutions with a focus on the executive branch and separation of powers politics. Much of his research focuses on the way in which presidents, Congress, and other political actors seek to control bureaucratic actions and the effects of these efforts on policymaking and agency capacity. He is also interested in the historical development and dynamics of separation of power systems in the US. Alex earned a BA in political science from the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD from Princeton University's Department of Politics. Prior to joining Emory, he held a postdoctoral position in Duke University's Social Science Research Institute. Sharece Thrower is an associate professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. Her research focuses on how both Congress and the courts constrain the president's use of various policy instruments, such as executive orders, signing statements, rulemaking, and regulatory review. Her scholarship has appeared in the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Law, Economics and Organization, and Presidential Studies Quarterly. Prior to joining Vanderbilt University, she served as faculty in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh. She received her BA from The Ohio State University and her PhD from Princeton University. And finally, I'm thrilled to turn things over to introduce our moderator, the Director for the Center for Effective Government, Professor William Howell. In addition to his role as CEG's director, Will is the Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics at the University of Chicago, with appointments at the Harris School of Public Policy, the College, and the Political Science Department, where he serves as chair. He is also the host or co-host of Not Another Politics podcast. Will is an expert on the separation of powers in American political institutions. Alex, Sharece, and Will, I'll turn things over to you for what I know will be an exciting conversation.
Great, thank you. So let me just share a presentation with you guys to get started. So give me 1 second here. It's always harder when you're on camera. All right, thank you all so much for the opportunity tonight to share our book with you. We're really grateful to the Seminary Co-op, to the Center for Effective Government for sponsoring this event, which happily coincides with the release day for our book, which makes it, I think, even more exciting to be here than it usually would be. So to start things off, I'm gonna just talk a little bit about the overall motivation and framing of our project and give you a sense of the book's broader argument and structure. So the starting point for our book is really these persistent concerns about executive power in the United States that pervade both academic and general political discourse in the contemporary era. So chief executives, both governors and presidents, have not been shy about asserting their powers, often seemingly in contravention of checks built into the political system, right? So it's not hard to look at the rhetoric that's on this slide here and be a little concerned that there might be problems with separation of powers in the US, and particularly its ability to limit the aggrandizement of power in the executive branch. And indeed, scholars and politicians have raised alarms about whether legislatures can cabin executive power in the United States today. And so the quotes on this slide are kind of representative of these views. So for example, Senator Mike Lee has claimed that it's really a lack of congressional will to assert power that's led to a vacuum that executive branch actors come to fill. Under this view, right, if Congress only had incentives to engage in sort of robust policymaking, then the executive branch could be constrained. Others are doubtful that anyone or any institution could ever reverse these trends. So most notably, Eric Posner and Adrian Vermeule argue that really nothing can be done about an imperial executive, and moreover, its emergence might be a desirable development. Despite these concerns, however, in this discourse, there's a lot of evidence in political science work on executive power that suggests that executive branch actors, whether it's presidents, governors, or administrative agencies, are actually quite differential or at least responsive to legislative preferences when they're making policy decisions. And we see this emerging across many different policy areas, contexts, and different types of policy instruments that executives employ. So for example, right, agencies issue fewer regulations when they have divergent preferences with the legislature. Presidents alter their behavior when it comes to deploying force based on the preferences of Congress. Presidents alter the size and content of their legislative agendas when they face divided government relative to a friendlier Congress. They install fewer political appointees in the bureaucracy when Congress disagrees with them over policy. And even in the context of unilateral actions, which is what we focus on the book, which require basically no congressional action whatsoever, presidents and governors seem to issue fewer unilateral actions when they're facing divided governments, when they seemingly have the most substantial incentives to engage in unilateralism. And so this raises the question of why would this be the case? Why do we see this level of executive deference to legislative preferences in policymaking? And so in our book, we're going to focus on legislatures as the source of this responsiveness. So whereas most work in this regard considers how interbranch ideological and partisan relationships between the institutions are going to impact constraint, we argue these relationships depend also on the capacity of legislatures to engage in constraining behavior and to deter executive actors from making policies that legislatures oppose. Moreover, right, we're going to introduce a new understanding of what capacity is. That is, what are the things that legislatures need if they're going to be able to fulsomely challenge the executive branch? And so in some ways, this argument might seem intuitive, right? Or if you wanted to be less charitable, obvious. Responsiveness to legislative preferences must arise from within legislatures themselves. But recent work raises doubts as to whether Congress or any institution has the capability or wherewithal to produce those patterns of constraint. With respect to Congress, right, people point to this dysfunction that's brought on by ideological polarization, supermajoritarian lawmaking institutions like the filibuster, and all of these things raise doubts about whether or not Congress can actually take collective actions to challenge the executive branch and protect its institutional power. And indeed, recent work mostly shifts to look to other institutions and factors, such as public opinion or the courts, to explain why we observe any degree of executive constraint in the US political system. And these quotes on the slide are kind of representative of this move in the academic literature. But we're not quite ready to cast off legislatures yet, because right, of this kind of persistent responsiveness to legislative preferences. However, we do take this point made by contemporary arguments emphasizing legislative weakness. And it's this, in large part, that's going to lead us to really take seriously the question of what legislatures really need if they're going to constrain executive power. There we go. So the traditional approach, right, would be to suggest something along the lines of James Madison's famous quote, right, that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And this ambition might come, as Madison would suggest, from institutional pride based in separate bases of power, or it might come, right, as people often argue, from competing visions of policy that arise from interbranch ideological or partisan conflicts. However, right, there must be more to the story, since, as the previous slide pointed out, right, legislatures may want to do something, but it's not always clear they have the ability to act on those preferences, right? So we argue that wanting to constrain the executive branch is not sufficient to induce that kind of constraint. So the the simplest version of our argument then, right, is that they are going to need this will and the ability in order to constrain executive branch actors. And so we're going to propose a conceptualization of capacity that separates it into two different domains. So the first is policy making capacity. That is, do legislatures have the opportunities available to affect the policymaking process? The most obvious opportunities that exist for legislatures to act is to pass a new law. But legislatures also possess non-statutory policymaking opportunities like oversight or agenda control that they can also leverage to constrain executive branch actors and impose costs on them for doing something they dislike. And the importance of these non-statutory powers in particular is heightened in this era when passing a law is really difficult because of polarization. In addition to those opportunities, legislatures are also going to need resources in order to act on them. And so these resources are going to vary considerably, but it's going to be things like staff and budgets and information and expertise that legislatures can tap into in order to take their will and translate it into a meaningful policy instrument. And so what we argue is that legislatures need to have both these opportunities, this policymaking capacity, and resources if they're going to be able to limit executive power. So overall then, right, our book addresses three main questions. So the first is the question of what is capacity? What do legislatures need to constrain executive power? The second question, right, is how does capacity affect legislatures' ability to constrain the executive branch? We argue here that capacity conditions the use of ex ante and ex post controls like discretion over policy implementation and oversight. And both of these types of things are needed to constrain executive unilateral power. Third, we ask how capacity shapes executive incentives to exercise unilateral power. And we focus here on unilateral power, that is tools like executive orders and memoranda, because they don't require any legislative assent to go into effect. And so in that way, they're really kind of a tough case to find the effects of legislative capacity. However, we argue if legislatures do have high policymaking and high resource capacity, they're going to be able to constrain executive branch actors' use of unilateral directives. And the patterns of use of those directives is going to be showing some level of deference or responsiveness to the preferences of Congress. If a legislature lacks any of those domains of capacity or both of them, then we expect that executives are going to have a much freer hand, and we should see them kind of ignoring Congress or the state legislature when they're deciding to use these types of tools. So this is just kind of the overall structure of our book. So in chapter 2, that's where we propose our new conceptualization of legislative capacity and outline the theoretical argument. Chapter 3, we're addressing sort of the origins of congressional capacity, where it comes from, and what has led to increases and decreases in that over time. Chapters 4 and 5, we look at discretion, the ability of Congress to control the policy implementation discretion that the executive branch has, and oversight to see how changes in capacity have changed the ability of Congress to engage in those actions that can constrain executive actors. And then in part 3 of the book, chapters 6 and 7, we examine how presidents and governors respond to capacity. So in chapter 6, we examine presidential unilateralism from 1905 to 2019 and demonstrate that whether patterns of unilateralism are consistent with constraint or executive evasion are going to depend on different indicators of capacity. And moreover, we demonstrate a link between discretion that Congress gives to the executive branch ex ante and how much presidents engage in unilateralism in different policy areas. And then finally, we're also going to examine unilateralism in the states. And so there we're looking at over 20,000 state level orders that were issued from 1993 to 2013, and again, find support for our core theoretical framework, this idea that you need both policymaking and resource capacities to constrain the executive branch. So finally then, to wrap up, in addition to sort of the academic contributions to the work, we also see our work as contributing to active policy debates about whether Congress today has the resources and powers that it needs to fulfill its institutional roles. And our work delves into understanding how capacity can impact, right, executive incentives, demonstrating the importance of these questions for separation of powers. So on the one hand, our book and the other work that we cited earlier appears to suggest, right, that Congress does have some of the necessary capacity today to constrain presidents when they want to. When they have both the will, they have the capacity as well. However, this is largely constrained in a binary sense, right? Is there responsiveness to legislative preferences or not? Yes or no? But we can also think about sort of the degree of constraint that different levels of capacity in Congress induce today and historically. And that can allow us to think about how changes, reforms that are being proposed might impact the balance of powers in the American political system. And so by directly linking capacity and executive action, we're able to draw these types of conclusions and hopefully help to inform the debates that are happening today about how we can reform Congress and make sure that it guards its institutional power. So that's all I have. So I'm going to unshare my screen now and let somebody else talk.
Alex, that was a terrific summary. And Alex and Sharece, congratulations on the publication of this book. Hooray. I've been looking forward to seeing it for a long time, and it's terrific to see. We should say from the top that, this book is at once elegant and has just a lot going on. It's an easy read, it's clear, it's transparent, and there also is just a ton of research going on. You're estimating all kinds of models and doing all kinds of measurement strategies and trying to identify these core principles that govern how legislatures check and when they check executive power. And, we're gathering under the guise of this democracy series. And in important ways, this book is at kind of ground zero for concerns about democracy. You don't bill the book as a kind of a democracy book per se, right? You're not directly engaging a host of debates and discussions that are out there in the world about the health of democracy at home and abroad. But look, debates about democracy more and more have to do with concerns about presidential power, and not just presidential power generally, about the exercise of their unilateral powers, and concerns about how and whether they're checked, how they're limited. And what you've done in this book is underscore a dimension to these checks that has been underappreciated. I mean, people have been writing about unilateral powers for a good long time, but they have not taken seriously this notion of legislative capacity. That is the not just whether or not members of Congress or members of state legislatures have an interest in amending or overturning actions that presidents or governors take, but whether or not they have the ability to actually follow through. And what implications that has for the exercise of power. So, hooray, everybody get the book. So you did a terrific job of summarizing it. I want to unpack a little bit of it and then put some questions to you if I could. And again, encourage our audience in the Q&A function to add questions of your own, which we'll get to shortly. And first, and maybe Sharece, we need to hear from you. We want to hear from you. So I'm going to direct this one to you. And disabuse us of the notion that we might have going into this conversation that capacity is a fixed quantity, right? Congress is what Congress is. It's designed in a certain way. And so it just as state legislatures are. And so there isn't any meaningful variation either over time or across states when we talk about legislatures when it comes to this key quantity of interest. That clearly is wrong. Tell us how and why.
Well, first of all, I want to reiterate Alex's appreciation for having us. And I also want to say what an honor it is to be here and to have you, Will, moderate this conversation. Will's work has inspired not only our work, but a whole generation of new presidency scholars. So it's very cool to feel full circle in writing this book and having Will be our moderator. But that wasn't to avoid your question. to answer your question, so there's a lot of different ways that legislative capacity can vary. So particularly in the book, we make an argument that the resources of Congress has varied a lot over time. So in chapter 3, we look at these sort of broad reforms that Congress themselves have passed. And there's these kind of big bipartisan legislation that have been passed over time that has infuse Congress with a lot of additional resources. So staff or creating new informational offices. And you see those big changes happening in those sorts of resources and additional funding and things like that. And particularly another source of variation, if we're looking at sort of broad overtime trends, is you think about Republicans taking over the House in 1994 and wanting to sort of scale back those gains in congressional capacity out of their desire to sort of cater to their constituents and live up to their promise of having a smaller government. And part of that was decreasing spending on itself. So when you look at trend data and like staffing and things like that, you see a dip in those sorts of congressional resources during the time too. But at the same time, one thing that we're excited about in the book is not only are we looking at sort of this variation over time, but there is a ton of variation if you look at between different congressional committees and the type of resources that they have, and over time within committees, how that might change. And what we're really excited about is looking at the variation in both the resources of legislatures, but also the powers of legislatures that we see across states and within states. So in chapter 7, we talk a lot about the reforms, these sort of big reforms that happen in state legislatures, a lot of times in response to how legislatures are perceived. So, turn of the century, they were seen as being super corrupt. And so we have a lot of state reformers scaling back the resources of these legislatures. And then and giving more power to the governor. But then at the same time, as you go more into the 20th century, then the public is perceiving the governor as having too much power. So they're giving powers and different sorts of resources back to state legislatures. And so you see this sort of back and forth happening within the states. And you see also this sort of big debate in the states about term limits, which we feel have implications for the human capital ability of legislatures. Obviously, because the longer that they're able to stay in office, the more experience they get, the better they're at their jobs. And we know from this sort of literature in state legislatures that there's a ton of variation when it comes to term limits. So that's just from the top of my head, sort of all the variation that we see. I don't know if Alex had anything to add to that.
No, I mean, I agree. There's just been a lot more variation than I think we popularly perceive. So like, if you look at Congress, it's really remarkable to look at the resources that Congress has access to and how it's changed over time. So if you look at like the first half of the 20th century, it's a flat line essentially. And when you think about everything that's happening in the government and public policy from 1900 to 1945, it's remarkable, right, that the size of the government's increasing, the presidential office is increasing in size, and Congress, right, is staying exactly the same. And so you get these big punctuations, right? But as Sharece said, there's also retrenchment as well. And I think that's like another important part, especially when we think about politics today and where we might be headed with capacity, that this isn't a one-way ratchet, and some of these reforms have been durable and some haven't. And so it's important to think about what underlies them.
Great. So we've got lots of variation over time and across states. And you're going to, in terms of the capacity that legislatures have in order to enact policy, to oversee a bureaucracy, to respond to actions that that governors might contemplate taking when exercising their unilateral powers. And so what gets down to the kind of core of your argument, and that you present a great deal of evidence for, is that, well, presidents, when they're thinking about whether or not to exercise these powers, to issue an executive order to take one action or another, they have to think, well, what's the likelihood I'm going to be amended or overturned or shut down in the aftermath? I mean, of course I can issue the thing, but that doesn't mean that the policy is going to endure. And therefore, they're not just looking over and paying attention to whether or not they have a bunch of co-partisans, a bunch of people who agree with them and who will support with them. They're also paying attention to the capacity, the ability of legislators to act upon whatever preferences they have. And looking over and seeing a bunch of people who may be lined up against the president ideologically, but who can't do much of anything because they're playing from a position of weakness, then presidents, governors have reason to push forward. But if they see those opposition forces conjoined with a whole lot of capacity, well, then presidents, governors may stand down. Do I have this roughly right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one way to think about it that's like maybe the starkest reform that we talk about is like the Federal Register Act, right? So before the Federal Register Act, like often executive orders weren't even published, right, in a way that Congress would know that they had even been issued in some cases. And there's famous examples of things getting to the Supreme Court, and it turns out actually the executive order didn't say this, or it was repealed a long time ago and no one quite knew. And so that's a stark example of how like Congress in that case doesn't even have the capacity to know that something has happened, right? That's just like one stark example of how to think about it. And you can imagine that when Congress doesn't know that, or they don't have the expertise to understand sort of like what the president has done or how they might respond to it, then presidents have a much freer hand. They have less to worry about from interbranch relations than they do when they know that Congress is watching them very closely and prepared, if necessary, to like engage with either these statutory or non-statutory powers that they have.
And another thing that I was thinking as you were describing the argument, Will, another great example that we've been seeing over the past couple of years is the state response to COVID-19. So you have this case where you see a lot of the stay-at-home orders or the responses to COVID have come from the governor. And you see different cases across states where state legislatures might be frustrated with what the governor is doing, but they don't have simple powers like the ability to call themselves back into session, which we categorize as one of these policymaking powers that are important to be able to retaliate against the governor. And we've seen that in several states. And so that's sort of another example of maybe Congress, legislatures wanting to respond, but just not having the basic ability to do so.
Which then frees up governors to do as they so choose, right? And so terrific. Help us. I mean, we've got this finding in our little corner of the discipline that's been a curious one. I mean, it's one that I've written about that, and it's I think it's pretty robust, which has puzzled a lot of folk. And you guys, I think better than anybody, clarify what's behind it. And the finding is that during periods of divided government, presidents tend to issue fewer unilateral actions than during periods of unified government. And it's sort of puzzling because you'd say, well, wait, you should rely upon these unilateral powers precisely when all these opponents occupy Congress, because that's when you can't pass a policy agenda legislatively. And yet what we see instead is that, no, they're passing all these unilateral directives during periods of unified government, which is precisely when you have a lot of support within Congress, which then you would think, well, then use the legislative process, pass things that way, and then the policies you'll get will be more durable. And you guys come in and say, no, what you're missing is, again, this interaction between capacity and divided government, or the preferences of a legislature as they relate to a governor. So, Sharece, can I point to you again and say, what's the finding that you guys present, and how do we make sense of it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that question that you laid out, Will, is exactly the question that motivated us to think more broadly about this whole project. So, the media and conventional wisdom and what presidents and governors say themselves, they advocate what the literature has called this evasive view of unilateral action. So, Congress is getting in your way, or Congress that doesn't agree with you, and you can just act unilaterally to get around them. And I feel like that argument is very intuitive to a lot of people, and that's how they perceive unilateral action. And like you said, well, the literature has consistently found the exact opposite, that we find evidence of what we call the constraint view, that, executives in the face of oppositional legislatures actually decrease the amount of unilateral action that they rely upon. And so Alex and I were trying to understand, why is this the case? Why is it the case that we find evidence for the constraint view? And our thinking was, maybe it's not about asking, why we see constraint, but under what conditions we see constraints. And that the main key to when we observe constraints or presidents and governors using evasive tactics is based on legislative capacity. So the ability of legislators to actually retaliate against them. So underlying this constraint argument is the fact that executives are deterred from exercising unilateral powers when facing oppositional legislatures because they fear that these legislatures are going to retaliate against them. Yet, we argue that they're only able to retaliate against them if they have sufficient resources and sufficient power. So if they have enough capacity. So when capacity is high, then we see exercises of constraint under divided government. But when capacity is low, and in the absence of legislatures being able to retaliate, not having the resources or the policymaking powers, then we see the evasive view prevailing, that executives can actually use more unilateral power to get around oppositional legislatures that are in their way. So the answer is it just depends on sort of the resources and opportunities that legislatures have to constrain the executive branch.
So that the point estimate actually flips. When capacity is low, let me make sure I've got this right. When capacity is low during periods of divided government, presidents, executives are more likely to rely upon their unilateral powers. They look over at Congress and they say, oh my God, there are nothing but political enemies there. What can I do to affect change? I can issue executive orders and memoranda and the like. But when capacity is high and they look over and they see all these partisan opponents, then they say, oh my God, right? Not only can I not pass something legislatively, but I'm gonna, if I issue these unilateral directives, they're gonna come for me. And so I better sort of forbear and scale back. And so in that sense, when capacity is high, then the relationship switches exactly, right? Which is
exactly.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say exactly. And one other thing that sort of to kind of contextualize this too is one of the very first findings that we saw evidence for is when we look at historical Congresses and historical patterns of unilateralism. So we mentioned that we have this consistent finding in the literature that presidents are issuing fewer executive orders during divided governments. But most of that literature is rightfully so focusing on this later time period, this post-World War II time period, where by this time, those Congresses in this post-war period look very different from those Congresses in this pre-World War II period. These earlier Congresses didn't have the same sort of resources, didn't have the same sort of capacity as later Congresses do. So actually, when you look at patterns of unilateralism in these early time periods, you see the exact opposite. You see that sign flip, as you're saying, Will, that these earlier presidents were able to use these evasive tactics and use more unilateralism during divided government. And so that's one of those things that got us down the path of, well, where else does capacity vary and things like that, and help us delve even more deeper.
And so for those people who are saying, oh my God, presidents are running roughshod over democracy, right? And these unilateral powers are something to be concerned about. What you would say is, well, pay attention to both elections. It matters who you elect to the adjoining branches of government, but also pay attention to the investments made into those adjoining branches of government, the kinds of resources that are made available to them. Because if what you want to do is get serious about checking executive authority, you need to push forward on both of those fronts.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also reiterate the point that Alex made on one of the slides, that legislatures must have the will and the ability to constrain executives. And I think a lot of times we focus on the ability part of it. At least people think, does Congress have the resources to constrain the executive branch? And a lot of people are saying no and worried about that because they're seeing a flourish of executive power. And, you know, while congressional capacity can always be enhanced in a lot of different ways, we also want to point attention to the fact that the will part is also important as well. That, you know, what are the incentives of Congress to constrain the executive branch? What are their incentives to enrich their own capacity, particularly in a time where those measures might not be popular with all people? So thinking about both of those aspects really carefully, I think is central to evaluating the conditions under which executive power can and will be constrained.
Alex, can you unpack something for us, which is, when we're tracking trends in unilateral activity, right, where they sort of ebb and flow, and on any given day, presidents could issue an executive order and they may choose not to, but not doing so could mean one of two things. It could be that they don't make any advancement on policy, or it could be alternatively that they advance policy legislatively. So, right, there's sort of three options available to executives, right? I can do nothing, I can issue an executive order or some other unilateral directive, or I can engage Congress, I can engage a state legislature. So how do these sort of three choices that are available presidents, how do we make sense of it within the context of the argument that you guys are developing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from the perspective of durability, right, if you're a president and you want a lasting kind of achievement, the best way to do that is to get Congress to pass a law that is going to enshrine your program into the statute books. Because as we know, as Sharece's work has pointed out very nicely, right, presidents revoke these orders, right, very frequently when they get into office. And so because of that, you might have a preference if you're the president and you care about that durability to do things legislatively. But as we know, and as we look at Congress today, right, the combination of polarization between the parties and supermajority requirements for lawmaking, and by that, I'm mostly talking about the filibuster, it's often not going to be possible, even during a period of unified government, right, for presidents to get their priorities into law. And so that can lead presidents to turn to unilateral action, and Congress might actually invite them to do so. So like, I think a very good example of that happened this past year with respect to the eviction moratorium. And so in that case, right, the eviction moratorium had expired. Democrats controlled Congress, but not to a sufficient degree to be able to pass a new law that would extend it. And so you had literally members of Congress camping out at the Capitol asking not for Congress to act on this necessarily, but for the Biden administration to step in and extend this eviction moratorium unilaterally. And so because of that, because it's really hard to pass a law, presidents have an incentive, right, to turn to unilateral action. And like during unified government, when Congress has similar preferences, even if they can't enact them because of polarization and supermajoritarianism, they might be freer kind of to issue those types of orders and turn to that. And so in some ways, it's the second best solution from the president's perspective for durability, maybe from really like a governance perspective too. But right, that's kind of the case that you're put into based on sort of the political conditions that you find yourself in.
Terrific. That's really clarifying. A couple more questions, and then I want to turn to the audience. And on both of these questions, I'm going to kind of I'm going to take the spirit of your book and step slightly kind of adjacent and ask something that runs parallel, which is, how do you feel? All of your attention here is about capacity vis-a-vis legislatures, but of course, legislatures aren't the only constraint on the exercise of unilateral powers. There also are courts. And Sharece, this is something that you've done writing on outside of the context of the book. Do you want to argue that the kind of core elements of your claims about capacity and the incentives that individual judges might have to overturn actions that presidents, governors take unilaterally carry over to the courts? You're not looking at it empirically, but is the basic argument, would we expect to see play out there? If you were to go out and collect all the same kinds of data, but looking at, state courts all across the country, would you expect to see something similar?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, because that's exactly what I'm working on.
Okay.
My next book, if I'm going to plug this, eventually I want to write a book about the relationship between executives and the courts. And I suspect that, as you said, on the state level, we might get a lot of variation in the capacity of the courts, say, in things like the workloads that they have, the clerks and the staffs and things like that. And I expect we should see similar sorts of dynamics, but I have to think carefully about sort of the scope of exactly what courts can do might be more limited, since the enforcement of their actions, of course, come from the executive branch. So I'm still sort of thinking through that. But in this book, I mean, courts are noticeably not front and center, but they're kind of working in the background. So for instance, we talk a lot about discretion and the fact that presidents and governors need discretion in order to issue these sorts of actions. And there could be different types of discretion, but sort of one sort of enforcer of discretion is the courts. And so that's one way that the courts are kind of in the background, but I totally agree that I think a more thorough treatment of courts front and center needs to be had. And we can't talk about a separation of power system if we don't talk about all three branches of government. But
so
hopefully I'll get
stay
to
tuned.
that.
You'll have more on this
yes.
in time. Good. Alex, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think one thing that I think comes out in your work, Will, and we agree with and see in this book too, is like the institutions can support each other too, right? So if courts want to strike at sort of executive power, like knowing that you have Congress backing you up and muscularly trying to constrain the executive can be an important factor. And you could imagine it works similarly, although we didn't investigate this in the book, with the legislature, right? If they're pretty sure courts are going to kind of make sure that their preferences are well represented in sort of these judgments, then it's possible that they kind of can work in tandem potentially as well to constrain executives.
Yeah, so it's not just whether or not the argument carries over to another branch. We ought to be thinking about how these branches interact with one another and join forces or not in the service of checking executive authority. So another question for something which isn't laid out much in the book, but I'm wondering if you might kind of reflect a little bit upon it. Alex, if you could lead on this one, which is that the book does a terrific job of underscoring, particularly as it relates to Congress, changes in legislative capacity over time, particularly over the last century. But of course, we also know that there have been massive changes to executive capacity, huge differences in their ability to collect information, to in the service of writing executive orders and implementing executive orders and memoranda and national security directives and proclamations and on and on. Should we be thinking, so I'm wondering, should we be thinking about sort of legislative capacity as an absolute quantity, something that stands apart from, or is it legislative capacity in relation to the strengths, the institutional strengths that executives have, which may be playing an important role in shaping these politics?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that we looked at in writing the book a lot and researching the book a lot and trying to think about how to incorporate it. And so kind of what we came down to in the end was there always appeared to be first an advantage, right, for the president in that he is not only in control of the broader executive branch. And so unlike Congress, the president has a vast array of agencies, right, that he can call on for expertise. And actually, like a lot of executive orders, as Andy Rudalevich's work has pointed out really nicely, often don't even originate in the White House, but like from the agencies themselves, right? And so in some ways, right, the president's capacity to coordinate, right, all of that kind of policy development has definitely increased over time. They've always, though, right, I think had this kind of advantage as an executive branch to basically be able to come up and develop these policies and put them into policy-making instruments like an executive order and a memorandum, to the extent that the Congress like really has not. And so that was always, I think, a challenge with thinking about how do these changes that we see like in the executive office of the president on the one hand, right, which has grown considerably since the 1920s, and that allows presidents to better coordinate that kind of policy action within the executive branch. How much does that matter relative to the expertise, the repository of expertise that exists within the executive branch writ large, right? And so thinking about that kind of twists the question a little bit into sort of like, who's like the primary mover, right, of these policies versus sort of like, do the questions that we have in Congress, which is like, can they even do these things? And so in that sense, right, it was really hard for us to think about how do we operationalize what executive branch capacity looks like as a whole. We do look in different parts of the book at like the presidential office, for example, as a measure of that executive capacity. And we generally don't find like similar types of effects that we do when we look at legislative capacity. And I suspect the reason is for that the president is drawing on a much larger sort of set of actors than we typically conceive of sort of as being the president's people, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, the capacity that executives draw upon is being served for, I guess the way I would put it is slightly different functions than the capacities that legislators are being drawing upon in these politics, because Congress, legislatures matter insofar as they represent and act as constraints on the exercise of power. But there's not a constructive agenda. That is, they aren't going out and writing policy on their own. They're responding to policies that are written within the executive branch. And so you may need all kinds of bureaucrats in order to say, here's the right policy and here's how to write it, and here are all the details that are needed that presidents need to draw upon, which isn't exactly what Congress needs in figuring out whether or not they want to strike it down or mend it in one way or another.
Right.
Okay, so we have questions from the audience and I want to turn to them. And I'm going to start with a question from Joe Ferguson, whose question I know comes from experience. He was here in Chicago, our Inspector General. And so he's going to ask a question of you of the following form, wondering how you factor for presence of resources that are not in the core institutional powers of the legislature itself, most particularly non-political oversight and accountability functions. At the federal level, the CBO, GAO, Inspector Generals, and the like, these functions do not exist consistently or with comparable rigor at the state and local levels. And so is this counted? When you count, and so the question is, how are you then measuring at the state level notions of capacity and how that differs from the kind of capacity that we might be looking at the national level?
Yeah, so at the state level, I think one real advantage at the state level is when capacity varies a lot and different types of capacities vary. So when looking at our first dimension of capacity, which is the resource capacity, so we're looking at the number of staffers per members in the legislature. And then we're also looking at, I think, legislative expenditures, and then also term limits. I had to think a second, like it's been a long time since I looked at this chapter, but also term limits as a proxy for the human capital. So in the absence of term limits, that's when we argue that legislatures can have higher human capital because they have the experience that they can build. And in terms of policymaking capacity, which is again the powers that Congress might have, we have a lot of different ways to measure that. There's not just one way that you can measure different sorts of powers. So we have powers like whether they're able to, they have the power to review regulatory actions of the executive branch, whether or not they have the ability to call themselves back into session or to set the agenda. And as I was talking about before, we see that in the case of the pandemic response, how important that is. And then we also have, I think, agenda setting powers and powers in the budgetary process. And I think I'm forgetting one or two of them, but there are a lot of different ways. But in terms of resources, I think back to your question about these different offices, we didn't have the data to see if the state legislatures have those specific informational offices analogous to the federal level. But like I said, there are a lot of different ways that you can measure these dimensions of capacity. And unfortunately, we were just sort of limited by the data that we could acquire at the time. But we're pretty confident that at least we're tapping into some very interesting sources of variation.
Yeah, and I'll just say too, like at the federal level, those are absolutely included and sort of what we see as the resources and expertise that Congress has to tap into. And so IGs, CBO, GAO, we talk about a lot in sort of the historical development of Congress, and they're captured in some of our measures at the federal level.
So concerns about democracy are not just domestic in nature. There are lots of concerns about the state of democracy abroad. And when we think about the health of democracy in other systems of government, we often are, attention turns to the actions that a democratically elected executive takes in order to claim power and pursue a set of autocratic ambitions. And we have a question here wondering about whether or not your arguments are relevant for, do you expect them to carry over to parliamentary systems? Is this just a story about presidential systems, or are there important corollaries to a parliamentary system and lessons for people who are doing democracy enhancing work in a parliamentary system that they ought to draw from your work?
Yeah, I think the first big difference, right, is going to be the fusion of the executive and the legislature and the parliamentary systems. And so that's going to create or take away at least some of that kind of interbranch conflict potentially that we see in a separated system like in the United States. That said, right, there has been some work about the capacity of parliaments in different systems. So Huber and Shippen have some work on this in Europe, where they're looking at sort of how capacity changes and showing that that can be an important factor in sort of the types of laws, right, that are ultimately passed in the parliamentary system. And you can imagine, right, that that would be a way that legislatures, just like in the US, could at least be monitoring kind of what's going on to a greater degree. So I absolutely think there's a role for a capacity in a parliamentary system, and it's a desirable thing. It's just, it would be a little different in terms of like the kinds of cross-branch conflicts that we experience so regularly here in the United States are muted, right? And so in that sense, it would have a different flavor, but it doesn't mean capacity could be less useful, I don't think.
We have a question about gridlock and contemporary gridlock, particularly as it applies to climate change. So here is this massive issue that I think many people would argue requires a government response. And we're in a period, by your measures, actually, at least historically, of reasonably high congressional capacity, and yet a total unwillingness on the part of Congress to take meaningful action in this space that's born not just of opposition to the issue, but because of widespread disagreement on the issue within Congress, which yields this gridlock. So is this a time when we've got one but not the other? That is, we've got some capacity vis-a-vis Congress, but at least in terms of the composition of Congress, doesn't allow for legislative change. And so what we ought to expect is if there's going to be action in this space, at least in the short term, we should expect it to happen unilaterally. Or are we missing something here?
I mean, I think that's fair, but I also think we have to think about the incentives of the president to act unilaterally in this issue as well. So, not only do we talk about his ideological incentives, but his incentives to sort of bolster the party. If the party's divided, where does that leave the president in acting and trying to please the party? And also the president's electoral incentives for himself and his party. If the president has those incentives to sort of act in an issue area where it might not be clear about what the constituents sort of really want. But this is definitely a time where legislative action, as you said, is very difficult at the time, but we also have to think about these other incentives that the president might hold too, if that's going to motivate the unilateral action in the first place.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of change over time in this too, where often in the 1970s, Congress was often a leader and kind of pushing the government towards environmental standards, right? And we see sort of as that polarization has taken hold, there's kind of much less action in general from the government. And so now I think you do see more presidency-led kinds of efforts. So international treaties are kind of an example of that, but you can't implement those, right, unless you have sort of the political coalitions in Congress to do that. And so it's going to be, I think, a persistent challenge. And I agree with Sharece that I'm not even sure within the president's party today, there's total assent about what ought to be done, right? And so I'm not even sure you could get 50 votes, let alone 60, right, to implement some kind of sweeping climate legislation today. And so as much as you might have the capacity, if you don't have the will, right, or the ability to get a majority in Congress, you're going to be stymied. Unfortunately, that's kind of for me, the bottom line.
Yep, that's very helpful. So we've underscored throughout our conversation the relevance of your argument for thinking about matters of institutional design, but I'm going to push you a little bit further, and one of our audience members wants to push you a little further, and in a way that we aren't accustomed to being pushed as political scientists, but it's constructive, I think. So is there an optimal point? Is there an optimal amount of capacity that legislatures ought to have? Do you want to come out and to say more and more and more investments are necessarily a good thing, all else equal, in the capacity of legislatures? Or are there, I mean, you had pointed to corruption, concerns about corruption as a reason to dismantle the legislative powers. And then what you do is you underscore how that has implications, not just for what the legislature does, but also the powers of governors. More generally, how much is too much? Or can there not be too much when it comes to legislative capacity?
So that's a hard question to answer. I don't think we've reached the limit quite yet to what capacity could do. So as we mentioned before, like, and at least in contemporary era, we're like below where we were in like the 1980s and early 1990s. And so a moderate increase in capacity, I think, could do a lot to lead to greater constraint of executive power. And I don't ever think we could get unlimited capacity because of the challenges that, the political challenges that attend to increasing Congress's capacity. So public opinion seems so ambivalent on capacity, right? So on the one hand, people want Congress to have power, right? They're in polls say they don't want presidents to have more power at the expense of Congress or other institutions, even if it would have sort of policy outcomes necessarily that they would like all the time. At the same time, they support term limits, right? They support less spending in Congress, right? And so I think those things are always going to militate against sort of having too much executive legislative capacity, but that's not a super satisfying answer. But I don't think we've gotten to the bounds, and I don't ever think we would get to it just based on sort of like the contemporary politics around capacity.
Yeah, you're passing the buck. You're to the public and saying, well, this is where they're at. I'm not so sure myself.
Yeah.
Fair point. I'm not either. It's a really hard question. Look, we've reached the top of the hour, and I want to give you each a chance to share any final thoughts if you have any. And before I pass it over to you again, like, checks and the balance, everybody. It's just a terrific, stimulating, rich book. Sharece, final thoughts.
Reiterate thanks. And then I guess my final thoughts would be just to remember that in order for executive power to be constrained, legislators must have the will and the ability. Both are necessary conditions. And I think that's the tagline of the book. So you're going to take away one thing, I think that would be it.
Yeah, I would also just reiterate, thank you so much for this event and to everyone for attending. My final thought would just be that I feel some optimism after writing this about Congress and its ability to play a meaningful role in our political system. I think there's a lot of concern about what it can do as an institution. It's not perfect for sure, but I think that they have the ability and we can enhance it, but like Congress can play a meaningful role in constraining the executive today.
Alex, Sharece, thanks so much. It's a terrific book. And Sadia, close us out.
Thank you. Thank you, Will, Sharece, and Alex for a fascinating conversation. And thank you all for joining us for our third installment of the Democracy Series, a joint initiative from the Seminary Co-op, the Chicago Center for Effective Government, and the Chicago Center on Democracy. Our next event is on Thursday, January 20th, where we'll sit down with Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt to talk about their book, How Democracies Die. Please be sure to find the Chicago Center for Effective Government, Chicago Center on Democracy, and the Seminary Co-op on Twitter. You can follow us at Chicago CEG and Seminary Co-op at Seminary Co-op. Thank you again for spending this evening with us, and have a great night.